Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 4, and quite possibly the last part, of Little Blue Book number 1122, and it is titled The Degradation of Woman, written by Joseph McCabe. Copyright 1920-ish. And we left off at the beginning of chapter 5. So, here we go. Let me get an itch going there. The Middle Ages and Women. It seems so very obvious, as I state the case, that Christianity deeply injured women, that the reader will wonder how its apologists sustained their claim. I have already explained this. They all stress the pardon of the adulterous woman by Jesus, though this is, as I said, a transparently apocryphal. Okay, let's try that again. Apocryphal. Wow. Transparently apocryphal story, and it suggests the peculiar position that Jesus, as man-God, forgives adultery, but as God, he punishes it with eternal fire. All, again, emphasize the new virtues which were taught to the world, and this is equally untrue. Catholics, in fine, make a point of the elevation of Mary, and they forget all about the still higher positions of Athena, Minerva, Juno, Isis, Cybele, etc. But there's another way of making out a case. I think it is the German socialist Bebel who tells his readers that in the year 585 AD, a council of bishops at Macon solemnly debated whether women had a soul. This is impossible, since obviously not even the most ignorant priest can doubt, or even did doubt, that women, as well as men, are damned. So the apologist looks into the Council of Macon, and he triumphantly tells us that all that happened was just a little grammatical breeze as to whether the word man can include woman. That is how the case against the church is fabricated, he says. A great point is now made of this in apologetic literature. I have looked up the account of the Synod of Macon and the abominably written Historia Francorum of Gregory of Tours, and it is by no means clear that the bishops were merely quarreling about philology. A bishop, Gregory says, objected that the Latin word for man ought not to be used to include woman. Boy, I pronounced that weird. Woman. There are, as a fact, 2 Latin words, but here there is a question as to the generic word homo. Now it is so obvious to even a first-year student of Latin that the word means human being, that the point of this obstinate bishop is not at all certain. The other bishops had to convince him by such extraordinary arguments as to the fact that Jesus is said in the New Testament to be the Son of Man, yet he was the son of a woman. My impression is that, though no bishop could doubt that woman had a soul, this man was so impressed by the inferior and wicked nature of woman that he resented the inclusion of her in one word with man. Another modern argument is that the acceptance, at the point of the bayonet, of Christianity by Europe coincided with the destruction of civilization by the northern barbarians. Goths and Vandals trod the whole empire underfoot in the 5th century, and Goths and Vandals have actually become proverbial names for wreckers and destroyers. Is not this a sufficient explanation? The new law of Europe was a combination of the old law with the laws of the invaders. It sounds plausible, and it is quite false. If there was one single point in which the Goths and Vandals were not barbarians. It is their respect for women. Centuries earlier, the Roman historian Tacitus had held up the Germans as models in this respect for the Romans themselves. Instead of the claim for Christianity finding any relief here, it is doubly discredited. The apologist has now to explain how the Goths and the Vandals lost all their old respect for women, as well as explain the loss of all women's rights and privileges under Roman law. There is no need to attempt here to trace the gradual descent of women. Her position at the beginning of the 19th century is enough. It was a legacy from the Middle Ages. Pagan Rome had made of her a personality. Christian Rome degraded her to a chattel, a dependent, a weaker vessel, a wholly inferior creature. From the 5th century onward, she sank steadily though differently in different countries. In England, women had a good deal of political influence. I mean, women of the noble families, almost down to the Reformation, though the position of the mass of the women throughout the Middle Ages was vile. In most countries, the days of chivalry, which were plainly due to the old pagan spirit of the Teutons, maintained for a time the position of the aristocratic woman. Incautious Catholic writers sometimes quote this age of chivalry as one of the proofs that their religion won respect for woman. That all that they know about it, as a rule, is from Tennyson's puritanical version of the legendary King Arthur and his legendary knights. Chivalry was a glorification of lust, the lust of fighting and the lust of love. If a woman was pretty and aristocratic, she met very courtly deference. If she was aristocratic and not pretty, she had a worse time than the Greek matron had had. If she was pretty and not aristocratic, well, the adventures of Rebecca in Scott's Ivanhoe, which comes nearer to the historical truth than Tennyson's pretty Ides, fairly illustrate her chances in life. And I have no idea what those books are, or references are too. If anyone knows, put it in the comments. In short, this argument from chivalry is one more good illustration of the feebleness and carelessness of all religious arguments. As I said, a beautiful and noble woman had quite a good time. Knights fought for her favors. You may or may not trace in the influence of Jesus of Nazareth, either in the fight, which was a real deadly combat, or in the tender reward of the victor. But it is more important to keep this clearly in mind. Not one woman in tens of thousands during the age of chivalry got the least advantage from its armorness. You pick out the baron's pretty wife or daughter and remind us of the knights bowing to the dust before her, and you say nothing whatsoever about the wives and daughters of the 10,000 serfs or yeomen, or even craftsmen and merchants. Their life could be hell. They were protected neither by law nor religion against the lusts of these very hot-blooded and masterful knights. And then you boast about the religion and the brotherhood of equality of men. There has been a good deal of talk about the medieval jus primia noctis. No idea. The right of the lord to have the peasant bride in his own bed for the first night. That's... wow. Or the first few nights. Holy shit. After the wedding. What? Someone discovered that there was such a right in medieval Europe. And for a time it figured as an important item in the indictment of the Christian Middle Ages. Now, religious writers say, it has all been exploded. Modern historians find that there was no such right. The church has been libeled as usual. There was no libel whatever. The jus primia noctis was for centuries and over a large part of Europe a recognized institution. Sometimes it was the bishop or abbot who had the right to the bride for a night, if his retainers reported her a virgin and attractive to the episcopal palate. As late as the 16th century, we find the French peasantry rebelling against the odious custom. It was well known in medieval England. It was not generally or a formal law for the simple reason that barons and abbots did not dream as a rule of waiting until the peasant's daughter married. She was rarely a virgin when she did marry. Bede, the English clerical chronicler, tells us that in his time in England it was the custom of the lord to take to his harem any attractive peasant girl on his lands, then sell her when she became pregnant. There was hardly such a thing as chastity in Europe during the Middle Ages. A wench was a wench. Does anybody imagine that a peasant or a smith would go to court in the Middle Ages when a soldier or a noble manhandled his daughter? Miss Catty Stanton hardly exaggerates when she says that mankind touches the lowest depths of degradation in the medieval treatment of women. The brutality and grossness which the Church suffered to spread over Europe was bound to degrade women when the strong arm of Roman law no longer protected her. Europe had undergone one of the most amazing transformations in history. Streams of barbaric Goths and Vandals had poured all over it. Their fertility seems to have been stupendous. They crossed into Africa and swamped the Roman province of North Africa, as well as Spain. Law and justice and education disappeared. The barbaric chief became a feudal noble and was a law to himself. His women became as loose and vicious as any wealthy Roman woman who had ever lived. Conjugal morals returned to brutality, says Legouvé, the historian of female morality. French. Pause for hydration. And a scratch. No one questions that several centuries of moral chaos, of the densest ignorance, and most unbridled license and violence followed the Christianization of Europe. But how, I am asked, could one expect the Church to tame at once these myriads of hot-blooded barbarians from the north and the mixed population they bred everywhere in Europe? The answer is quite easy. As far as the treatment of women is concerned, the pagan myths of these barbarians had persuaded them to treat women with respect. If you hold that the Christian myth was even more favorable to women, how is it that it entirely failed where paganism had succeeded? The plain truth is that the old Teutonic religion had taught men that woman is a superior being, and Christianity taught exactly the opposite. One modern historian has gone so far as to say that the Goths and Vandals embraced Christianity because it taught the inferiority of women. They now had a free run. It is, at all events, clear that the teaching of the fathers continued to be the belief of the bishops. That is to say, when they happened to be really religious, which was not often. It was precisely the best Christians, the men most eager to apply Christian doctrine to life, who damned women. All through the period of chaotic transition from Roman civilization to the later civilization of Europe, we find gatherings of bishops depreciating women, like the Council of Auxerre, 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 in 578, which said that women must not, like men, take the sacramental cup in their own hands because they are impure. The decrees of these councils of bishops and of the popes make up what is called canon law, or church law. When Europe settled down again to a rudimentary sort of civilization, its law consisted of fragments of the old Roman law and the native laws of the barbarians, with a good deal of canon law. The church was all-powerful. Abbots and bishops were dispensers of justice. Now both the Roman and the barbaric laws had been favorable to women, yet the new law of Europe was grossly unjust to her. It was then that she was legally and socially degraded, that she lost control of her person and property, lost her legal personality, and lost all respect except that which a man pays to the woman whose caresses he desires. Sir Henry Maine and every other authority traced the degradation to the church law. Maine says, "No society which preserves any tincture of Christian institutions is likely to restore to married women the personal liberty conferred on them by the Middle Roman law. By the proprietary disabilities of married females stand on quite a different basis from their personal incapacities, and it is by the tendency of their doctrines to keep alive and consolidate the former that the expositors of the canon law have deeply injured civilization." Sir Henry shows that the British law, which through colonial days was responsible for the state of things in Boston as late as 1850, which I described in the first chapter, owes all its enormities to church law, and therefore to Christianity, and no one with the least authority on the subject questions this. One of the recent feminist historians, who certainly does not write from an anti-clerical point of view, Mrs. G. Hill, says, "Although women appear to have had a wider field of activity than they afterwards enjoyed when social life became more complex, there was a counteracting influence which told against the development and free exercise of their energies. This was the influence of the church. It was the policy of the church to keep women in a subordinate position." The wider field of activity in the Middle Ages means that all sorts of trades were open to women. Some, like brewing, were almost monopolized by them, as the population was kept almost stationary by war, famine, and disease. There was no sex rivalry in work. Women have always had liberty to work. Let us grant man that. When Miss Hill and others remind us that women might become abbesses, a new trade opened by Christianity, one must again deplore the lack of sense of proportion. For every abbess who had a little power, there were tens of thousands of women whom the church had degraded to the level of children or cattle. It is as if the world had discovered what Genesis really taught. Male and female created he them, says the English Bible, but the Hebrew word for female is literally a thing to be perforated. That was all women had become. You may say that the church provided an escape from all the brutality, the nunnery. Alas, most nunneries during the Middle Ages were totally corrupt. In any case, it is a rather curious service to the race to make a country desolate and then provide one or two retreats amongst the desolation. The monastic idea was, in fact, hastening the degradation of women. One of St. Bernard's monks was implored by his parents to return, and the saint wrote for him a letter to the parents which includes such gems of Christian sentiment as this. And this was written in a letter. "What have I to do with you?" He uses the very words of Jesus to his mother. "What have I received from you but sin and misery? Only this corruptible body that I bear do I confess that I hold from you. It is not enough for you that you have brought me into this miserable world, that you, being sinners, have begotten me in sin, that being born in sin, you have nourished me in sin. But you must envy me the mercy of God I have obtained, and wish to make of me a son of hell. You may choose to neglect your own salvation, but why should you wish also to destroy mine?" Oof. Little bastard. This is the third in the official collection of Bernard's letters, and Bernard was the very flower of Christian piety in the Middle Ages. But it is needless to brood any longer over the period of women's degradation. It was in every respect, except art, a foul period, a state of semi-barbarism, and while the Church can be indicted only for permitting the hourly violence, the fearful cruelty, the sordid ignorance, the universal exploitation, the incredible filth and disease, and the almost equally incredible growth of prostitution and monastic hypocrisy, it has a direct and clearer responsibility for the injustice of women. And that is the end of chapter 5. Now on to chapter 6. Chapter 6 is titled The Clergy and the Modern Struggle, and that is modern for 1920s. After about the year 500, human life was suspended for 1,000 years, says a brilliant French writer. Something like that certainly will be the unanimous verdict of historians when our scholars have shed the last trace of subservience to the clergy. At present, some of them have an affection of showing that the Middle Ages were not quite so bad as the older historians had said. It is wrong. It appears to call the early Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, because by diligent search we can find a lamp in it here and there. But we may see enough about the Middle Ages in other books as far as our present subject. The degradation of women is concerned. No one is quite so foolish as to try to defend the Church. By the year 300 AD, woman was in a position of freedom and respect. She had enjoyed the position throughout nearly the whole 4,000 years of civilization. After the year 500 AD, allowing 2 centuries for the application of the principles of the new religion, women fell to a state of degradation which has no parallel in the history of any pagan nation. For more than 1,000 years, during which Christianity absolutely dominated the life of man, she remained in that condition of degradation that requires a good deal of explaining if you are reluctant to admit the obvious fact. Christianity degraded women. And there is no room here for the familiar quibble that it was not Christianity, but the men who professed it, that injured women. It was quite plainly the doctrine. It was the morbid Puritanism about love and the legends of Genesis. The men who most drastically neglected women to an inferior position were the men whom the churches regarded as their religious heroes and oracles. The perfectly attired modern preacher in a Fifth Avenue chapel somewhere will scarcely venture to say that he knows more about Christianity than did St. Gregory, St. Augustine, St. Jerome, or St. Bernard. Pardon me. Nor is there any room for the further familiar quibble that it took the world a long time to realize the true implications of the Christian spirit. Modern Christianity, wherever it makes this claim, has not discovered a new meaning in the words of Jesus, but has discovered his teaching. The medieval and Catholic doctrine of monasticism is a perfectly sound implication of Christ's teachings. Jerome and Athanasius and all genuine monks and nuns did exactly what Christ advised. The fundamentalist is, in this respect, a modernist. He rejects whole chunks of the teaching of Jesus and Paul just as cheerfully as he rejects the prediction of the end of the world. Christian teaching, the teaching of Jesus and Paul, implied that women were inferior, that her moral weakness handed the race over to the devil and lost us paradise, and that her sweetest charms are so many baits on the devil's hooks. The emancipation of women was impossible as long as people really believed the teaching of Jesus and Paul. A well-known preacher once showed me, with some pride, a sermon of his on the woman question. The text was one of St. Paul's consecrated bits of rudeness to women, and the sermon then began. That is where Paul and I differ, precisely. The true story of women's recovery of the position she had held under paganism can be told in a few lines, and it is actually more significant and instructive when it is so told. From the 5th to the 15th century, from the death of Hypatia to the time of Petrarch, at least, no one had a good word to say for women. Not a scholar in Christendom, not a priest or writer was inspired to make a syllable of protest against the disgraceful injustice of the system. It was the literary men of the Renaissance who began to raise women, the women of their class, to a position of equality, and the Renaissance was, notoriously, the rebirth of paganism and skepticism. Then came the Reformation and what Catholics humorously call the Christian Renaissance, or a half-hearted attempt to reform the morals of Rome under the lash of Protestantism. Europe became again intensely interested in religion. Many millions of people cut each other's throats in the name of religion. The civilization of Europe was put back 100 years by the zeal for religion, and the attempt to emancipate women was once again crushed. The opinions of feminist writers about the effect of the Reformation vary remarkably. Out of 6 which lie before me, Miss Cathy Stanton regards the Reformation one of the most important steps, and Miss Gage thinks that the anti-Christian bias against women took new force after the rise of Melanchthon, Huss, and Luther. Lecky believes that, in restoring the credit of marriage, the reformers rendered a great service, and Professor Carl Pearson finds that they caused a material increase of prostitution, which is impossible in the opinion of anybody who knows the Catholic Middle Ages, and darkened the prospect for women. Most of these writers argue from a theoretical point of view. Luther gave a shrewd and healthy blow at the Catholic glorification of virginity and all the hypocrisy caused by it. But he also said such things as, "No gown worse becomes a woman than the desire to be wise." To say that he robbed women, how many, of opportunities by suppressing nunneries is fatuous. But he certainly provided no other opportunities for them. The 3 Ks, Kirch, Kutch, Kinder, church, children, and kitchen, were stereotyped as the ideal of the German woman. The Reformation did nothing for women on the continent of Europe. In England, in the Elizabethan age, educated women, a tiny minority, had more freedom socially, though they lost their last hold of public life, and their freedoms were plainly due to the end of... Sorry, the page is ripped. Plainly due to the Renaissance occurred together. Okay, Reformation... Oh, okay. Plainly due to the fact that in England the Reformation and the Renaissance occurred together. The Reformation, through a statute of Henry VIII, forbade women and others of low condition to read the Bible. The humanists invited them to read. But the historical facts that are clearly enough. But the historical facts are clear enough. Okay. Protestantism of a pure or puritanical type was as deadly to women as Catholicism. What did she get from the Puritans of England or New England, from the Calvinists of Switzerland, from the Lutherans of Germany and Scandinavia? Nothing whatsoever. Protestant divines were as blind to the injustice of the system as Catholic divines were. The service of the Protestantism was indirect, and I would stress that in this sense it was mighty. It smashed the tyranny of Rome and could not set up a lasting tyranny of its own. Yet, to use a phrase of Emerson's in a different connection, Luther would, if he had foreseen the revolt of the woman, have cut off his right hand rather than nail his thesis to the door of the cathedral. This is the stark truth about the redemption of women from all the injustices which Christianity had brought upon her. Not one single Christian clergyman the world over raised a finger in the work until it had so far succeeded that the clergy had to save their faces by joining it. No amount of pulpit rhetoric, no amount of strained apology from Christian feminist writers can lessen the significance of that fact. And to it you must add another of equal significance. The men and women who started the revolt against the injustice and carried it to the stage of invincibility were non-Christian, in the proportion of at least 5 to 1. Take the movement in America. 3 of its greatest leaders, Miss Cady Stanton, Miss Gage, and Miss Susan B. Anthony, have described minutely and conscientiously in their monumental history of women's suffrage. It began in 1820 when Frances Wright, a deist, a pupil of the British agnostic Robert Owen, invaded the States. She was joined by the brilliant Ernestine L. Rose, a Polish Jewess who had cast off all theology, by Lucretia Mott, a Quaker whose views were regarded as heresy, even in the Society of Friends, by Abby Kelly, another rationalistic Quaker, and by the Sisters Grimke, also Quakers. I have shown in my biographical dictionary of distinguished rationalists that Miss Cady Stanton, Miss Gage, and Miss Anthony, who led the fight in the next generation, were all agnostics, and for 50 years, as this detailed history shows, the clergy of America were the most deadly enemies of the movement, basing their opposition expressly upon the Bible. I smiled. Make sure that's the right page. Yep. I smiled when in 1917 I was invited to speak for the movement in New York. It was then respectable. Parsons were available by the score. Few women in the movement had ever heard of Fanny Wright or Abby Kelly or Ernestine Rose, and the other splendid pioneers. None knew of the time when pastoral letters had circulated amongst the American clergy, calling their attention to the dangers which at present seem to threaten the female character with widespread and permanent injury. That was all over. Preachers were now assuring them that Christianity was the best friend, the only friend, that women had ever had. It was the same everywhere. In Britain, the pioneers were Mary Wollstonecraft, Fanny Wright, George Eliot, Harriet Martineau, all rationalists, supported by Goodwin, Robert Owen, Jeremy Bentham, G.J. Holyoake, and J.S. Mill, all agnostics or atheists. In Germany, the work was done by Max Stirner, Karl Marx, Buchner, Engels, and Bebel, and Lichtenbrocht, all atheists. In France, it was Sieyès and Condorcet, atheists, who first pleaded for the emancipation of women, and George Sand, Michelet, Saint Simeon, and Bouvier, all deep-dyed heretics, who raised a plea again in the 19th century. In Scandinavia, Ibsen and Björnson and Ellen Key, all rationalists, led the protest. Let the women of the world read their remarkable story once more, with open eyes. They will. No, not yet. But in time will come when the women of America, and it may be this generation in your high school today, will put away forever, not on gently, the figure of Christ, will burn Paul in effigy, and will raise a superb monument to Voltaire. We're still waiting for that day to come. Well, that does it. That is the end of Little Blue Book number 1122, titled The Degradation of Woman. The first book in a series of 3 that I will be reading. Thanks for joining me, and come back for the next Little Blue Book.